Welcome to a special recording for the Jean Monnet module. We have with us a guest, Dr. Martin Farek. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for joining us. Martin is the head of Department for the Study of Religions in Pardubice University, Czech Republic. And today we'll have a short conversation about India-Europe contact, what frames that contact, and what are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. Yeah? Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much for warm welcome. It's an honor to be here again.
Thanks, Martin. So, just to begin, how long back does India-Europe contact go?
Many millennia back. Of course, it's a question what we will count as Europe, but the Babylonians and Egyptians a few thousand years ago would be counted as Europe, but there has been proven contacts between these very ancient civilizations and Indus Valley civilization or Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization. But what we should start to talk about more seriously is contacts in the Hellenistic period, let's say from the 3rd century BC. There you have a lot of interesting things happening. First of all, as everybody knows, in the 4th century already, Alexander the Great with his armies conquered the large Persian Empire. His armies reached the borders of what used to be called India. He conquered several local kings and he came back. But the following period is more interesting because Seleucus Nicator founded a dynasty, and this part of his Alexander's empire had direct borders with Indian kingdoms. And this is a period where many contacts started, diplomatical and political, of course. In fact, it should be mentioned, against the textbook story, especially West is very proudly explaining how Alexander the Great conquered India. What is more interesting and important is that Seleucus Nicator wanted to defeat Chandragupta Maurya, and according to the records we are having, he didn't succeed. And Seleucus' army was much larger apparently, and it seems from the things we know about the peace treaty between Seleucus and Chandragupta, that in fact he must have been defeated, Seleucus, because the conditions of the treaty doesn't point to a big victory, rather the opposite. And since then they started, Seleucus and his ambassador, this is the famous Megasthenes.
It's Megasthenes, his ambassador
to India. This is how some reports become created, and we have some remnants of Megasthenes reports on India and later Roman historians. What we can tell about this period is that it was important not only for diplomacy in that sense, but also for exchange in trade, and of course for exchange of knowledge. And this is how Hellenistic period could be also described. Many things in different fields, analysis of language, astronomy, geometry, arithmetics, and other things have been developed apparently together. So it was an interesting period of very rich exchanges. We have traces of Indians being in Alexandria in the famous Museum, the seat of the knowledge. The library was not only library, it was a kind of university. Many Mediterranean scholars gathered, the largest of the sort apparently in the 3rd, 3rd century BC. So there were Indians, there are traces of Indians there. So many things were happening, and it was a very fruitful period, I think.
So from my understanding of what we study as Indians in the textbook, it seems as if the contact seemed to be just trade, but you are emphasizing that it was not just trade.
Definitely not only trade.
Some kind of knowledge exchange.
Knowledge, yes. There are also remnants of the exchanges in astronomy.
astronomy.
The Jyotishas and certain Shastras are telling us that Indians and Greeks must have been collaborating.
Okay, so in some sense there is a knowledge partnership
Exactly.
between Indians and Greeks.
Exactly.
And does that contact break at some point, or how does it develop?
Well, this is a question which I think still needs much more research. Some specialists have been into it, but the general story given by historians is that when Caliphate came in, Muhammad's empire and what happened later, this is very often depicted as building a wall between Europe and between India. But we have to take into account several other things. Southern Indian kings, for example, have been sending diplomatic missions, ambassadors to the courts of Caesars of Rome. Hadrian's court, Trajan's court, others.
What period would this be?
We are talking already the centuries AD, after Christ. Right? So we have traces of that in Roman records. And of course, archaeology is showing more and more how Romans settled here in the south of India.
Romans settled in India?
There were Roman settlements here in the ports. Apparently this must have been very rich trade exchange as well. All these things were also possible because the Roman Empire, despite all the problems in the last 2 centuries especially, still was a kind of very stable partner. I can imagine that politically what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD could create in itself a condition where many of these new kings and new kingdoms emerging and again disappearing in Europe. It was what is called sometimes the dark period of Europe, etc. Most of them might lost interest because there were much urgent issues to solve home. And as I am saying, after the 7th century rise of the Islamic Empire, things changed, that's clear. How does it change? I don't know. There are some historians working on Arabic writing, and it can be shown that lots of learning in the new Caliphate was also still developed on the earlier exchanges between Greeks and Indians, and also they had some direct contacts like Al-Biruni and others.
Okay.
Something was still going on.
Something was still going on, even through the Islamic Empire.
Through the Islamic Empire.
So there is some contact, but there's a change in the nature of the contact, you would say. That's how you would characterize it.
That's what we can say.
So whereas the Romans had very clear place given to partners in trade, honor given to Indian kings as visitors, that kind of contact does not seem to happen in some space, some period, let's say around the 5th century onwards. That is not the contact that we see. But in India, from my textbook perspective, it seems almost as if India and Europe discovered each other, or rather Europe discovered India in the age of discovery, 14th, 15th, mainly 15th and 16th century, and before that what existed was sort of not very significant.
But in a certain sense it is true because of Europe and its development or problems, let's say. What we know about the heritage of the ancients, the Greek and Hellenistic and like the Roman period, is that much was lost in the wars. The new kingdoms coming, the new people coming to Europe, the so-called Germanic tribes, that my predecessors, Slavic tribes, and all other
wars in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, these were wars that finished the Western Empire. Eastern, the so-called Byzantium, still had been going on, but also shrinking after a period of flourishing. So these periods of many wars and problems and changes, especially in the western part of Europe, brought about a lot of damage to the traditional learning. Lots of these things were lost, and they were recovering only through Arabic knowledge that retained much more from this ancient period.
Okay.
So what you have in the Western chronicles, in the Western biblical history, in the Western cosmographies about India, is still the traces that were left from the ancients, and they were repeating them for many centuries.
Okay.
Here and there, of course, you had some missions to India, diplomatic but mainly missionaries tried, but they were very few in numbers compared to the earlier contacts. And apparently the larger image, the dominant image of India was still the remnants of the ancient knowledge, but damaged. So,
what damaged the ancient knowledge?
oh, I think that many things were simply lost during wars. That's what we know. Yeah, we know, in fact. Yeah.
So, if I understand you correctly, at least some dimension of the relationship between India and Europe seems to be a kind of knowledge partnership, and that broke down.
That is what we can say, but of course, there I am not an expert. There is certainly a contact between Arabs and Caliphate, and then later empires under the flags of Islam, which happened in Mediterranean. In Spain, southern Italy, they still have been in contact. Some scholars still were studying from Arabic sources whatever was there as the ancient knowledge.
Okay. So then, do you think that you said that it's true to some extent that the age of discovery is important for India and Europe contact. So what happens during this time?
I would say it's important, but it was also unfortunate for some reason. When the Portuguese started to explore first Atlantic Ocean and Indian Ocean in the 15th century, several drives were there, trade of course, spices, gold, precious stones, silk, food, many things. And spices, this is the most famous thing. Europe get used to pure spices. They were very costly, and this is something that really draw many of Europeans to think, now we have to find other ways. One thing. Second, mission in the sense of spreading Christian religion abroad. Very important part of that effort. And of course, some hopes that maybe we can also gain some land, etc.
Land?
Land, yes, also. And why I say it is unfortunate, because in this constellation, Portuguese were not so much seeking knowledge. That was not the main drive, certainly not. And the way Christian scholarship developed during the 15th century, but so much earlier, this didn't give much space really to be interested in the local culture, because in the eyes of Christians, your forefathers were either Muslims. There was a knowledge that there will be some Christians in India, but when they started to come and discover what is really there, most of the local people were heathens, following this or that kind of idolatry, which is not interesting at all. It's something that is not good. So most of these people were not really interested in
knowledge. But why was it unfortunate? It was unfortunate for Europe or unfortunate for India?
I would say for both parties. Because first of all, the main trust was upon power. Portuguese built, of course, a special kind of empire having only ports. They didn't affect the interior. In the interior, Mughal Empire hardly affected. But they started to take over the trade in the Indian Ocean, Gulf, and also along the African coast. That was the main thing. Riches, trade. And then to your forefathers, the message must have been these Europeans are just coming to get riches, maybe land. That's all. It's not establishing a very good framework for equal partnership, does it?
So in some sense, the contact was impoverished during this age of discovery for Europe. for both parties,
I would
impoverished
say
for
so.
both parties.
There were exemptions. Some missionaries, like Roberto Nobili, they were fascinated by the scholarship produced in India. They started to study Sanskrit, Tamil, some other languages, but these were in numbers more or less exemptions. And you see it even later when Protestant missionaries came. There was an interesting mission in Trankebar, coming mainly from Germany. Pietists, right? Protestants and the special
Pietists, pietists.
special pietists. Yes, there was a special movement within the Lutheran Church. It was called Pietist movement, and these people came to India. One of them, Bartholomäus Ziegenbalg, produced some books in German in his mother tongue about local traditions, local knowledge, local religion. But when he sent these manuscripts back to Europe, you know what was the reaction? You are there to convert people, to bring them the light of knowledge and salvation, and you are spreading their heathendom to Europe through your book. So they were not published.
They were not published
Just
even.
put them into archives.
So how do we know about them today?
They survived in the archives. And only very, very recently people started to work on them. That was the attitude, the general attitude. Here and there, especially Jesuits, of course, they tried, because some of them understood we will not bring the message, because this is a sophisticated culture. They have their own philosophies and, let's say, religions as they saw it. And the way we are doing in Africa and Americas doesn't work in India, doesn't work in China also. So here we have to do something else. But that was rather exemption, and also hotly disputed by some other orders. They criticized Jesuits for the so-called accommodation.
So Martin, if you could just highlight for us what are the important things that you want us to remember from what you have said so far about India-Europe contacts, let's say up to the 18th century or so.
I think that one point is to remember that these contacts have been always there, and they go back many centuries back. Well, intense contacts we can definitely trace from what is called the Hellenistic period. So this is late 4th and then certainly 3rd and other following centuries BC. This is a very important thing. Second, the nature of these contacts. They were on, of course, political, diplomatical level. Trade was very important, but what we see is also an exchange of knowledge, cooperation, real cooperation between scholars who did things. So that's another thing. We should not think it only purely in terms of political dimension or trade. And there we should also stress the last point I would like to highlight, and this is equality. And Indians and Europeans definitely took each other as partners. On political level, there is this nice story of ambassadors coming from a kingdom in South India to the Roman Empire court. They were treated very well, and in the games, they were invited to observe the games in Circus Maximus. They got the seats of senators, which was something of a very special honor paid to the foreigners. This was not usually happening even with very powerful kings on the Roman neighborhood. It tells you something about how important these people were for Romans. Of course, you have Tacitus and other historians complaining how much gold goes to India. Our gold and silver is sucked through trade with India because we want so much luxury. This is also telling you something about its importance. But I would like to say that also in terms of exchange of knowledge, they were seen as partners, and this is important. Partnership is there.
So 3 points. 1, that it's very old.
Very old.
2, that what you would stress is that it's a knowledge partnership.
Yes, not only
political trade, and not only politics. Right. And the third is that it seems to be on equal footing. It's like we have something to contribute to each other.
Exactly.
And we took each other seriously.
We are learning from each other.
We learned from each other and took each other seriously. Now, from an Indian perspective, this is very surprising, because for us, the way we study about our own history and world history, it seems as if India's relevance to Europe, Europe's relevance to India is framed by the contact in, let's say, 18th, 19th century and colonialism. And until then, yeah, there is trade, there's some contact, but we are not really relevant to each other. What would you say about that?
I would say this is the product of the very same period. This cup put on the earlier contacts. This reinterpretation where Europe takes the dominant role in the history of world as leading humankind towards better society, better knowledge, science, etc.
So you think the period of colonialism
perpetuated this story, picked up the Enlightenment story and perpetuated it, of course, yes.
And the story is that Europe leads the world in science and civilization.
Well, in science, culture, civilization, and religion too. For many Europeans, still we have the best religion. So.
The best religion. Okay. And yet, this is also the period when Europe begins to study India intensely.